guys join the SAHRC or the SAHRC conference Wi-Fi?
I think the one that I did last night was that one. That one. And it, like I say, it said it's very strong. Okay, so Brandon, can you record? Okay, it's streaming now still. Can you record? Can you? Mm? No, not yet, but it is currently streaming. I just want to make sure. Can you recall how I cut the screen?
You put your mouse onto the square, then there'll be those outlines.
Oh, got it, yeah. But it takes the screen width. Wait, if I drag it out of. Oh, the problem is I want to cut it and it doesn't want to. Can you come and check here?
Yeah.
Check here. It takes it width. And I actually want to cut it, but if I do this, I'm afraid we're going to lose some of the.
Yeah. If you just go into the little square and you go. Oh God. Okay. Yeah. I'm gonna get this far.
Scene collection.
What if you drag it this way and then to bring everything in and then you drag that out to you almost minimize the screen only to maximize it to its normal thing when you take that out.
Good morning. How are you? Good. Eileen. Oh, wonderful. Eileen. Nice to meet you guys. Your seat will be right there. We're just gonna set you up with a camera as well.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, we're just trying to figure out some last minute things.
Drag it in, make it smaller, and then now try and make it bigger by dragging that out. Yeah. And then you drag it and then you try and fit it.
Try to at least just this. We'll see. Just remember, everyone must just be muted. Kenneth, can you check on Facebook? Okay, there's about a 30 seconds, so just look. Hmm? As long as your sound is off. Okay, so it is on YouTube. It's fine on YouTube, but Still trying to figure the Facebook. Select is self-selected. Good gosh. Hi, Bakes. Is muted. Ek verstaan wat ek probeer sê is iemand anders in die kamer is nie muted nie. Okay, kan jy dit cut daai uit? Ek dink daar is 'n manier om te cut. Is everyone muted? Brandon, just check that everyone is muted, please. Because apparently we're not. Okay, I need to keep. Okay, bye. Yebo, madam. Very short, yeah. Basically hand over to you. Yeah, but you can do whatever you want. Then I'll just get from what you've said or not said. This is just formality, just to formally open and welcome, and then we could continue on to the proceeding. So we just need to make sure the first speaker is on standby. This should be here. Okay, so the first one is here in person. That's good. All right, Brandon, if we can set up, the first speaker is going to be here in person. Oh, okay.
the mic off there?
Unmute it. Do you want to go have a listen? Do you want to just speak into that, into the computer that side? Then we just test whether it picks up.
Enquiry at Eastern Cape, held in Beta, Eastern Cape. Just testing, testing.
Okay. Close it at one time. And the there's a hook so we can shuffle. Are you saying something after lunch or the breakfast one? Okay. All right.
The sound that you put off here on my computer. If we put that on our computer, isn't that the issue?
The thing is, Commissioner, we're picking up only from the software, the sound. Mm.
So I need to understand, is this the one that I look into?
Only the sound.
Oh, that's
So you can go
Oh.
proceed, yeah. And this is only the sound, and then we hope that it's going to pick up appropriately now.
That's fine, thanks. So do I start from the beginning or do I start
I think so.
from the beginning or?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much, Prof. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, once again. I've been asked to speak on the link between basic education and the regulation of appearance in schools. And so that's the overview. I'll start off by looking at what lies within the whole question of appearance in schools. And then I'll touch on South African policy and other guidelines as far as regulated appearance is concerned. And in all this, I'll be drawing lessons from research. And I'll end off by posing some pertinent questions as decided by the line of the presentation this morning. Right. So the first question, what really lies within when you talk about, a regulated appearance? And of course, it goes without asking that the question of clothes comes to mind immediately, and often the clothes that are prescribed, that is uniform, school uniform, as you know it, it's often, prescribed along the understanding of very clear gender defining, appearances. What should boys look like and what should girls look like? And I'll touch on the problematic within that later on. And then there's also the question of hair and hairstyles that we all know about. And we all recall the not so distant, Pretoria Girls High School saga and Sansusi Girls and many other schools in South Africa and elsewhere. And of course, there's also the question of the school's interpretation of what they see as presentability and cleanliness, and what that also poses a problematic that we need to deal with. And then linked to that is the idea of general gender conduct. How should, gentlemen conduct themselves? How should they appear? How should ladies conduct themselves and appear as far as clothes and other things are concerned? And one of the issues that research touches on, which I'm not really going to be looking into this morning, is the question of a preference of one school language as a form of uniformization. But that's a different context altogether, and it has its own nuanced debates, and I won't get into it at all because it doesn't constitute the idea of, appearance that I'll be talking about. So as it is the case with most of the highly debated issues, there are two distinct sides around the question of regulated appearance in schools. And as those are some of the authors that I drew from around the research that I have conducted. And then, of course, there are also some overarching views whereby, there are some people who fall somewhere in between. And the question would be, do I fall somewhere in between as well? It will come out, in terms of the questions that I'll be asking. And I think I must state that this topic, is very close to me because I teach inclusive education. And these are issues that we talk about all the time. I'm in a faculty of education in initial teacher preparation. And therefore, it's important for me to know that the student teachers that I work with when they go into schools, it will be the kind of schools that actually supports the principles of inclusive education that are a daily discussion with me and them. And so we'll see how far this goes. So, on national guidelines, especially I only saw the draft guidelines on school uniform. It appears that, school uniform is supported, but then there are also very clear guidelines as to how this should be carried out in schools, with some responsibilities being delegated to schools as to how this can be done in a very inclusive manner. But then what's also important is to realize that South Africa takes the issue of inclusivity very important, and especially as policy is concerned. We believe that, schools should be inclusive for all learners and that all children matter and matter equally. And therefore, that means it is a responsibility of all the stakeholders to eradicate any form of barriers to learning, even if those barriers to learning have to do with regulated appearance, as it were. And of course, one of the things that I came across when I was looking at the national guidelines on school uniform, I could only find the draft. I'm not sure whether those have been finalized or whether the submission is working towards that, was the fact that the state recognizes that school uniform could impose many barriers, and amongst those is the financial constraint on some families. And therefore, schools are tasked with, making provisions for learners whose caregivers cannot afford. So the question is, do schools really do that? And I think from some of the things that have been coming out in the media, etc., schools are not altogether doing that. Not every school is actually taking that responsibility to ensure that learners are not prevented from accessing their right to education, especially as far as appearance is concerned. I'm sure many of us have had anecdotes whereby learners are turned back from school because they're not dressed appropriately, either because the uniform is not as per the standards of the school, and I've heard that sometimes they have to wear blazers with school badges, and when that badge is missing, and that badge actually makes the blazer very expensive, then they could be turned off as well, being told that they don't look presentable enough. But those are really anecdotes, and I would like to come across a situation whereby they are properly documented and we can say this is actually the official stance and somebody has done research on this, and therefore we know which schools are actually doing some of these things. So, of course, coming back to the debates on the advocates of regulated appearance, some say that it promotes equality and social cohesion. And of course, the understanding here is if learners all look the same, they're wearing the same jersey, the same skirt, the same trousers, etc., even those who come from families that are not as wealthy and socio-economically, are outstanding, therefore like they're the same as everybody else. But then I think lying within that question itself is a question of whether everybody can actually afford the whole range of what school uniform imposes. For many parents who have had matric kids, you know what the matric year is like. You have to buy a special jersey, you have to buy a special this and that, and then these are things that you don't even see coming. It happens in that year, and the whole school uniform issue becomes quite and because you don't want your child to feel like she or he is an outcast within a school, you'll have to do everything that we can to ensure that they get all those things that the matric year comes in. And that's just one specific example that I have personally experienced. And then one of the reasons given here for those who advocate for regulated appearance is the fact that it provides visual cues about school learners as to where they belong to, the school that they belong to, and therefore instills pride and a desire for good ambassadorship. I'm not going to dispute that. I think that's a very good reason, that schools want to know that people who wear their uniform wear it with pride, and they represent them in communities, and then good things can be said about them. And there's another school of thought that, when children are in uniform, it also promotes discipline. I'm not altogether sure how this happens, but it seems to come out in a lot of research that it promotes discipline, and therefore, when they're in uniform, it prevents unwanted and unacceptable behavior, and thus allows for better learning and positive academic outcomes. Personally, I'm still trying to really understand how being in uniform in a classroom in a school setting actually promotes discipline, but I'm not going to dispute it because I've not really gone into understanding how that works, but it's one of the views of those who advocate for regulated appearance. Then we have the opposite side to this, of those who are opposed to the whole idea of regulated appearance. And there's a strong body of research on decoloniality. We can all think about Fees Must Fall from the university, landscape, and whereby people feel that school uniform enforces colonial mentality and in a sense undermines cultural variation. So one of the questions that are asked is, whose and which culture do uniforms predominantly promote? And when we talk about culture, once again, on the question of appearance, it's of course the clothes that we wear, it's the hair and the whole issue of appearance, even makeup and some of the talisman that in terms of the cultures that we belong to, the markings on the face, etc., which sometimes when kids go to school with those, they are called to task as to why are you coming to school like this? And a child finds himself or herself having to explain things which are contained within his culture and made to feel that he's not acceptable to look the way he or she does. And then, of course, another school of thought is that school uniform, forces diverse body types into similar clothes, which has a very negative psychological impact on growing up people, and it could lead to a negative self-image, because uniforms, when it's a particular style, is a particular style. Learners and their caregivers are not allowed to maybe manipulate that in terms of fitting a particular body shape. So people have to squeeze themselves into this idea of how the school wants them to look like. And of course, there's quite a lot that we can say on that as far as self-image and possible embarrassment is concerned. So, and of course, one of the things that we cannot afford not to speak about is the problematic of binary assumptions on the concept of gender. And I'll be talking about this later on at length, because I've had personal experiences around this, especially with the students that I teach who describe themselves as either trans women or trans men, and how the whole issue of school uniform beyond the confines of the school, even at university, has affected them. And and of course, it speaks to ongoing struggles of gender diverse students, in particular. And so another school of thought on those who oppose this uniformization of children on appearance is that it restricts their freedom of expression as enshrined, in the Constitution. And I know there are people out there who are also beginning to question the whole idea of rights, as to whose rights and where do they come from, especially when you look at debates between the global south and the global north. But I won't really go into that. But in terms of us in South Africa, we need to understand what the Constitution says and what that the implications are when people are asked to appear a certain way, despite whatever issues there are that sort of work against their rights, as it were. And then, of course, another question is affordability. I think I touched on that earlier on. And affordability in many instances makes a school uniform a barrier to learning, because we know of reports whereby learners are turned away from school for not wearing the prescribed uniform. I think I touched on this in my presentation. So I'm sure there's a lot more. These are a few that I could come across, but I felt that they, in a sense, both on the advocates of school uniform and those who oppose school uniform, the little that I've put here, in a sense, captures the essence of what you should be thinking about when you think about regulated appearance in schools. So going back to the question of gender, binaries, binary assumptions on the concept of gender. Interestingly, in the draft, the draft itself, I pulled out this table, which clearly says for boys, this is what we expect. For girls, that is what we expect. And for me, that is very problematic because as soon as we say that, we are claiming that there is only two ways of being. It's either one is a boy and one is a girl. And then we are really closing our understanding around the complexity of gender because the concept of gender is very complex. Then I'll come into my own experience. Years ago, I had a student being in a faculty of education who describes herself as a trans, gender woman. And of course, during teaching practice, we send student teachers to schools for teaching practice. She went to school dressed as a girl. And then I think on the information that we had sent to the school, we had said she was a boy or a male student. Then she was asked, so why are you dressed like a girl? Which is very embarrassing. She had to explain the whole issue. So she was told, no. Tomorrow you have to come dressed properly. And I remember I saw her now wearing a suit. It was a very uncomfortable sight to look at. And I really felt, helpless because we wanted her to do teaching practice, but the school had made it very clear that if you come to this school dressed as a girl, unfortunately, we cannot allow you to practice at our school. So she had to fit into this uncomfortable, clothes that could make her acceptable as far as the school is concerned. And of course, at university, it's easy. At university, everybody can be what they want to be. But here, she is now going into where she used to be, experiencing the same types of marginalization and discrimination that she grew up with when she was at primary school and high school. And so I think that is one of the many examples that people who are gender diverse, go through in terms of experiences. And so we also have the question of newly initiated young men in South Africa. I'm sure, that's very common in the Eastern Cape and even in Cape Town where I've lived for a long time. And I came across a research that was conducted by Ngcobo in 2013 who says that unfortunately most school policies do not have special 25 provisions for initiated learners. They neither allow initiated learners to wear hats nor carry a stick at school. You know that after when they're new initiates, they have to dress in a particular way. And because there's a regulated appearance in schools, very often the fact that they'll be carrying a stick, they'll be wearing a blanket across or wearing a hat or whatever, it makes them stick out like a sore thumb. And sometimes they are exposed to very uncomfortable questions and in terms of why they look the way they look and they don't look like everybody else. And I know that some schools are really trying to be understanding of all these different cultural expressions as to why young men at some stage will be dressed the way they do. And they are prepared to allow them to be without necessarily posing questions. But that's not always the case. We know of very traditional schools whereby a young man who's a new initiate cannot be allowed to express his culture in a manner that they're supposed to as new initiates. So, and of course, given this, uniforms are then seen to regulate who wear them in terms of class and gender binaries. So we are talking about not only the question of gender here, we are talking about class, we are talking about everything that's related to diversity as we know it. So and in effect, when all these things are left unchallenged, the question of what is presentable and what is not presentable, they will continue to hamper a positive self-image and can be very damaging to the young people that these regulated school uniforms are supposed to be for. but in actual fact, in many cases, they seem to be against them. And so, some ensuing questions that I thought we should consider. So, what are we saying about gendered restrictions of school uniforms? If we insist that learners have to wear school uniform, and will all these restrictions on the basis of gender continue to go unchallenged? And what are schools doing about that? Maybe it's one of the considerations. I'm not really making a prescription here. I'm just posing a question. And of course, what about the impact on individual expressions of identity? And I know that there is a question of good ambassadorship, but then what about me as an individual? If the school that I go to doesn't like dreadlocks, what am I supposed to? Just last week, some of the students that I teach, we were talking about related issues, and one of my students told me that she has a big afro, big hair, and then she was told at the school that she goes to that she has to wear it in a ponytail. The question is, how do you wear African hair in a ponytail? Really, I can't even imagine myself in a ponytail. So her mother put it in a big bun, and then she was told she should always sit at the back in the classroom because she's now obstructing the view of other learners from seeing the teacher because her bun is way too high. And I was thinking if she had been allowed to wear it as her afro, it would have been much easier. So there would have been no need for this, or the bun is too high, now go and sit at the back, etc. And she says she always felt very self-conscious as a result, like she doesn't belong to this school, which doesn't support the way she looks and the expression of self in terms of African ideas of what beauty is. And so in a sense, all these experiences speak to us about dilution of cultural experiences. What can we do about this when people's cultural experiences are being diluted? And of course, equally important, what about the impact on learners' mental health and self-image? If these things continue, what what exactly are we going to do about it, ultimately? And sorry, I need to take some water. And I think it's necessary for us to think about a more critical understanding of the intersection between a regulated appearance and other attributes of identity. And for example, being abled differently. I know we always talk about it as disability, questions of gender, as I've touched on it, social class, etc. And how do all these things come together to construct individual identities amongst the learners whose appearance is so highly regulated? So the way forward, I came across this in my reading that instead of arguing about whether uniforms are good or bad, then let's refocus our energy on making better garment designs and fairer school rules with an eye to supporting educational outcomes. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Um, Prof, if you can maybe just mute that one. I think it might be best until we just sort out all of our technical issues if we maybe pose three questions, and then we will give over to you for your response, if that's fine, Commissioner, if that's fine. And then after Prof's presentation, we'll just wrap up the last nitty-gritties in terms of sound. Tembelihle, sound? Okay. Commissioner, would you like to pose the first questions? Or
Yes, thank you for a fascinating presentation and really dealing with the issues at hand quite comprehensively, Prof. I'm also specifically interested in this matter of individual expression, and and as you have indicated, as you put it, schools have their own ideas of cleanliness and presentability, but then also of gender conduct. And it appears very specifically still that there are schools that believe that it is that boys should have short hair and girls should have I mean they can be however they want to wear it, but that appears to be a situation in most of the schools. So they would typically tell a boy with longer hair to cut it because he's a boy. That old binary kind of approach. Do you have any comments as far as that is concerned?
If we look at some of the proposals around why, appearance has to be regulated, and one talks about um, that it enhances positive school outcomes. I'm trying to think, how does hair add to that? I think I touched on the fact that even to me, it doesn't make sense. I'm still trying to understand the link between hair appearance, amongst other things, and positive, academic outcomes. So I would suggest that we need to really unpack the whole notion of cleanliness. What does it mean to be clean? And so I think there's a hygienic interpretation around that, and there's also a class interpretation around what it means to be clean. And as soon as we bring in the question of class in the equation of cleanliness, clearly somebody is going to be marginalized, because we have to be asking as to which class categories seem to be privileged and always promoted as far as appearance is concerned. And in all honesty, does having a short hair or long hair really matter that much when one is in a school situation? So I'll leave it as a question or a level at this stage, because I also don't have answers. But I'm of the opinion personally that hair does not matter, whether it's long or short. All that matters is learning. And from teacher education, it's also about the quality of what the teacher brings into the classroom that matters, and the support from the whole school that matters, not so much how learners look. And because schools should not be making learners fit into them. That's my interpretation as well. Instead, we should be inclusive of all the diversities that learners bring into the schools.
Maybe just a quick follow up there. Is there some or other what should be the criteria that you think can be used by schools to regulate appearances? You refer now to the ideas of cleanliness and presentability. Some would say maybe it should be about neatness, whatever the case may be. But then there can be so many interpretations of what that also means. So in a sense, what should be the guideline uh, in that regard? Should there be a guideline? Because it's always coming from a specific perspective when it is now judged whether someone is, as you pointed out, class also sometimes playing a role, all kinds of other factors and prejudices.
impose any guidelines. I think if it's left open-ended, that children have to come to school clean. I think clean for me it means I should have taken a shower or a bath, whether it's in a shower or a washing basin, whatever the case might be. That's good enough. And everybody, all of us know what it means to be clean. Therefore, the school should simply encourage the caregivers that make sure that the child comes to school washed. That's good enough. If we go as far as now putting prescriptions on what that means in terms of appearance, this is how it becomes messy, because we start now privileging a particular appearance over another and then taking away other issues. For example, if I mentioned earlier on the fact that some of us have markings on our faces, at maybe to mark a particular phase that you are going through in terms of growth, etc. So if I'm going through that job, I have to come with those markings, and then yet I'm clean, I have washed, and then the school says I'm not good enough because I don't conform to a particular prescription. That is problematic. So it has to be left open-ended, that children have to come to school washed and neat, and that's it. And how families do that is entirely up to them, not for us to go into any prescriptions of what they should look like, because this is where now it becomes problematic.
Thank you very much, Prof. I think maybe just a quick one from my side. Would you say that our current, and if I can put it, potential overregulation of appearance and school uniform needs to almost be decolonized? Why I'm putting that, and I'm throwing it to you now for your views, because it appears that a lot of codes of conduct is reflective of codes of conduct maybe 20 years ago. It also appears that it hasn't adjusted as our thinking and as our perceptions have adjusted, because we keep throwing it back to neatness and unity and pride, almost as if we've got this nationalist military that we are growing through uniforms and appearances. So my first question to you would just be, would you think that we need to move towards, as we have started the conversation about decolonizing education, decolonizing uniforms, the thinking of uniforms and appearance? That's the first question. The second one would be, in terms of regulation of appearance specifically, you've mentioned cleanliness and neatness, which for me is almost, I would say, and that's just a perception I'm going to throw out there, it's a perception at this stage. We haven't had enough information put to us yet, that that is put as opposed to, like you've indicated, freedom of expression, equality, non-discrimination, that vis-a-vis neatness and cleanliness. It's almost, one would say, which one weighs the most, but that's the purpose of this whole process, to, at the end of the day, see what is on the one hand side and what's on the other. So in your view, which one should be weighing the most, as coming from the educator's side? So that's number two. And number three, do you think that the current codes of conduct, which is, in my understanding, in terms of the Schools Act, also part of and parcel of the SGB's responsibility. Do you think that there's enough oversight in respect of the implementation of codes of conduct, whereas it's an SGB responsibility vis-a-vis a departmental responsibility? So that would be, is there enough oversight in that regard? And then my last question. Sorry. I think your answer will probably be very general because it links into each other. And the last one is basically, do you think, in respect of a code of conduct, that there's enough authority almost in a code of conduct? Or do you think we might be in need of legislation or a regulation or a specific directive from the department, for instance, on non-discrimination policies when it comes to natural hair? So it's just a basic, your views on whether we are keeping, do we think there's enough following of the schools of conduct and there's enough grounds almost from the school, the code of conduct? Or do we need some harsher intervention to ensure alignment? Okay, so that's mine, Prof. I'm going to.
I'll start at the end because that's what I still remember in terms of. So I'll start at the end in terms of the last question that you asked, especially on the regulation of hair. I honestly, especially when it comes to natural hair, I'm trying to think of my hair in its most natural state without dreadlocks, which make it much easier for me. The pain that I had to go through having to comb that hair and sometimes even being told it had to be relaxed. And I'm sure that's the pain that many people have gone through. I therefore think in terms of hair representation, learners have to be allowed to be. Nobody should prescribe that hair should be in a ponytail. Ponytail doesn't feature in my psyche, in my cosmology. It just doesn't make sense. I can't have a ponytail, honestly. So I'm of the strong view that natural hair should be allowed to be as natural as, as people want it to be, as their individual expression of their image. So, and as schools should not, I know some of the code of conduct go as far as being very prescriptive about how that natural hair should be managed. One of my ex-students, her child has beautiful hair. She goes to one of the schools in Cape Town, beautiful natural hair, big afro. She was told she's untidy. The mother was called to school 2 years ago. I know she complained to the specific education department about this, but nothing happened to the case. She was told the child looks untidy, but the child looks beautiful. I still have those pictures to date, and I'm thinking, so how untidy can one be really when this beautiful little thing is told she looks untidy? So in terms of the rules around her, those have to be scrapped, in my opinion. There is no need for those. And especially when they seem to work on people's unique appearances as far as their culture is concerned, if I could put it that way, or even in terms of how they are supposed to look naturally. And we say, no, this is not good enough. Go and relax your hair, put it in a ponytail. It doesn't make sense. That's number one. So it has to be scrapped off from all those regulations. If I had my way, I would actually go to every school to make sure that there's nothing like that in the regulations. So then you talked about decoloniality. I think in the 21st century, when so much is happening in the world, in South Africa, so much is happening in education, higher education. Look at the fees must fall, movement. I do not see why schools should be left behind because these things actually start at school level. And I think learners are suppressed and their parents, they are suppressed not to voice their opinions the way they would when they come to university. Then when they come to university, it's like they're just boom, everything is exploding. But then these things have long started in terms of how people are feeling about a need for us to decolonize a whole range of issues, decolonization of education. I know the decoloniality project by itself has had so many interpretations, and there is a need for us to really be very careful as to what we say. We are not, I'm not one of those people who are saying throw away all Shakespeare books, when you are decolonizing. I'm saying something different in terms of saying if we were to go into literature, for example, there's wonderful African literature that should also be introduced into schools so that, our children do not graduate or they do not leave schools only thinking about literature in terms of that. And the same thing applies in terms of, school uniform. If you look at the uniforms that girls have to wear, and you think of the climate in South Africa, for example, sometimes it really doesn't make sense. Why should a child be wearing this? It's hot, it's summer. They are told you have to wear a blazer. Inside a blazer, there has to be a sweater and then a tie and everything else. It just doesn't make sense to me. So I would say let's understand the context, the geographic context in which we find ourselves, what works best. I remember reading in social media, I think it was last year, how Ghana has now decided to rethink the whole idea of school uniform. And so they are now using, I don't know whether it's called kente cloth or something, to really make beautiful uniforms out of that, these African prints. And I was saying, wow, would be so wonderful if in South Africa this catches up and we see in the Eastern Cape girls going to school wearing, okay, in the school, I think the whole question of school uniform is about colors. So if we say it has to be blue, and there blue blue materials, which sort of fit within the context that we find ourselves, that school uniform could be made out of, instead of being so prescriptive and then making it so uncomfortable for other people, etc. So around the coloniality, I think there's a lot that needs to be we need to really open our eyes to and be prepared to discuss, because it's not just one interpretation that you should be looking at. So and all the stakeholders have to be part of the talk around what it means to decolonize school uniform, and beyond simply the clothes, as it were, but there's also issues of culture that have to come in. Then you also asked the question of, I think I've addressed three. I'm trying to, you asked four actually. I'm trying to remember the fourth one. Oh, okay. Oh, the cleanliness debates. Cleanliness for whom and by whom and how? That's a question. Because, like I said, the concept of cleanliness, I think it flows from a public health debate. So, what does it mean to be clean in terms of public health, prescriptions? And what does it mean to be clean in terms of the school itself? So, I find it very problematic, honestly, in terms of this idea of I have to look clean. So you look clean if your hair is like this, you look clean if your skirt is that long, you look clean if your whatever so it's a very problematic and loaded statement by itself, which very often leads to marginalization and discrimination. And therefore, if we say learners have to be clean and we want to push it beyond debates on public health, and then we bring in other things, we also have to be thinking about who are we privileging in terms of this notion of cleanliness. And what does it mean beyond simply a public health issue where COVID has shown us cleanliness means I have to wash my hands, I have to cough in my elbow, etc., so that other people don't have to be affected. But then when you bring the issue of cleanliness into child learner appearance at school, it takes on so many meanings which become problematic. And then the question would be, how then do we uh, should really the question be cleanliness, as it were, or should it be something else? I don't know the language that we should be using instead of cleanliness, but maybe this issue of cleanliness, which goes on to be very prescriptive around your hair has to be short, uh, you know, um boys have to shave all the time, and then hair has to be in a ponytail, the skirt has to be like that. That seems to be very problematic, and it gives rise to many other unintended, issues that we cannot ignore. Then it will take us back to the situation where all the time, the Department of Education, somebody wants to sue because they feel that their child's rights are not being respected within school A and school B, and therefore, what does it mean? So somebody should really be monitoring in all these codes that schools develop around how cleanliness is operationalized. What does it mean to be clean, and by whom and whose standards, etc. And I would think that when the Department of Education leaves it so open-ended and says the school has to decide, this is where the problem comes in, because now everybody comes with so many multiple interpretations that very often end up putting other people where they shouldn't be, really, creating unnecessary discomforts that we are really trying to do away with as far as inclusivity is concerned, and also saying that for us to eradicate barriers to learning. So I know it's a very broad, response, but that's the best way I could make sense of it at this stage.
Thank you so much, Louisa.
Thanks, Prof, for your presentation. I only have one question for you. You made mention of gender binaries and its effect on freedom of expression. So my question is on the impact on learners, especially when it comes to attendance. And
Definitely, it does impact attendance, because if we are talking about a learner who feels that within the classroom that he or she is in, he is not, she or he is not seen, is not represented. There is a possibility that the learner might actually desire not to go to school anymore. I think that goes without asking. And if you read literature around this about learners who say, I never felt I belonged, and even personal accounts of some of the students that I've spoken to about how they felt like maybe if I was at another school, I would be seen for who I am, not for what somebody desires me to be. And therefore, it does affect schooling, because it affects one's psychological well-being, and one begins to question themselves, and of course it enforces the idea that you're not acceptable, and therefore why do you accept yourself, which can actually be very detrimental on learners' mental health and well-being. So I think it's something that we also have to be very careful about. And if you saw the question that I posed at the end, it's not really a question. It's a quote from Ray 2022, who says, maybe it's time we stop arguing about whether uniforms are good or not, but think about, rules that support learners, if there are any such rules, and also better garment designs which are fairer, and of course as well as fair school rules, as it were. So I would say this, it definitely affects school attendance negatively.
Maybe on that point, I'll give you a very good example of how it did affect school attendance. There was at a school called School Strand, a girl that identified as a boy and wanted to wear that uniform. And that learner was not allowed to go to school for that reason. And it took the intervention from the South African Human Rights Commission, and the school decided then they will amend their code of conduct. But they didn't even want that to allow that learner back before they've amended the school code of conduct. But they took a week to do that, and in the process, that learner lost out a lot of school time. So I mean, these are real examples. It's not that it's not happening. So I just wanted to point that one out. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Prof. I think if we do have any follow-up questions, we will provide them in writing. Your presentation is very valuable as well. We will definitely keep it on record and take it into consideration in drafting our report and making our recommendations and directives. I think you've created a very good baseline for us to start this inquiry from. And I think we really appreciate your attendance. If you are available to follow proceedings on Teams or on YouTube, please do. I think it's going to be a very interesting discussion going forward. So thank you very much from my side. Zuki, I think we can pause it for now and then just take a 5-minute quick body break. Thank you so much, Prof.
My pleasure. Thank you for the invite. These are issues that are very dear to me as well.
So good morning again, everyone. We will now be proceeding to our next presentation, which would be from Mr. Nceba Mrebo from CGE, the Commission for Gender Equality. Mr. Mrebo, have you joined us? There we go. If we can possibly have your visuals on, sir. There we go. Good morning, sir. How are you? I think you're muted. Yes, I can hear you now. Just a quick sound test again, sir. Are you with us?
Yes.
Okay, good. We've got you. Mr. Mrebo, thank you very much for joining us. You are given the platform for your presentation, sir, where after the panel members will pose questions to you. So the floor is yours.
I've shared the slides with the colleagues. I'm not sure whether they have received their slides.
Do we have the slides, Suki? Mr. Mrebo, we don't yet have the slides. If you don't mind, I think we can proceed in terms of your presentation, and once we have it, we will share it on the platform, if that is okay with you.
It's fine. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you. The floor is yours, sir.
Good morning to the Commissioner Gam, and good morning to the distinguished panelists. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and also the members of the civil society organization represented on the inquiry today by the SAHRC Human Rights Commission. And in terms of the table of content of the presentation that I've shared with a colleague, firstly, I would like to talk briefly on what is our mandate as a CGE. And then, given the topic for today's discussion, sort of giving a little background, why are we discussing this in terms of the law that are relevant to the country, as well as the region, as well as the international law. And I'll also zoom in into the challenges with regards to the school uniform guidelines, as alluded by the professor before me, and also what is a proposed in terms of today's discussions, I was mandated by the commission to refer much on the position paper of the Commission for Gender Equality, as it still has to be adopted by the plenary. That is a disclaimer that I want to put forth before I proceed. The CGE does have a draft paper, but the plenary of commissioners, which is the highest body, needs to adopt it, and then it will then be made publicly. I will then talk in terms of our own observations as a province when it comes to school uniform and what interventions have we made when it comes to the LGBTIQ rights. In terms of the mandate of the Commission for Gender Equality, CGE is one of the Chapter 9 institutions set up by Section 187 of the Constitution, which requires the CGE to promote respect
and the protection and the development and attainment of gender equality. Further, our powers from the Commission for Gender Equality, we derive them from the Act number 39 of 1996, which mandated the CGE to monitor, evaluate legislation, policies, practices of the state, statutory bodies, and the private sector, as well as indigenous and customary and religious laws and practices. This is our mandate as a CGE in terms of monitoring legislation. We need to make submission while these legislations are still in bills, to make sure that the gender equality is catered for on all the bills that Parliament seeks to pass. We will then make comments through the Office of the Speaker as a CGE in terms of those particular proposed bills. The Commission is also empowered to research, to make research and make recommendation to Parliament and receive complaints on gender discrimination. We are also empowered to conduct public education on gender equality. The Commission for Gender Equality Act also empowers the Commission to subpoena or proceed with delegation to further its mandate. But we do this as a last resort in terms of the Commission for Gender Equality, where we subpoena either private entities, government, or members of the public. And we do that as a last resort after we have communicated with the individual on a particular matter on the basis of gender discrimination that may be laid or a complaint be lodged on the Commission based on that. But also the promotion of equality and prevention of oblige the CGE to institute proceedings into the Equality Court on instances of discrimination on the basis of gender. I'm sorry for that. On the basis of gender, the Commission, in terms of its vision, we seek to see a society free from all forms of gender oppression and inequalities. And we do this through the following: conduct research, public education, policy development, legislative initiative, and litigation. Of today's discussion, the drafters of our Constitution have made children's rights a priority and have stated that the best interests of the child are overriding concern when it comes to any matter affecting him or her. The Supreme Constitution Act 108 of 1996, Section 28 cites, I quote, "Every child has the right to basic nutrition, shelter, healthcare, and social services, as well as the right to be protected from maltreatment, neglect, abuse, and degradation." Close quote. Further, Section 29.1A of the Constitution recognizes the right of everyone to basic education, including adult basic education. Now, in terms of the South African law and the right to education, Section 9.3 states that may not be fairly discriminated against, and state may not fairly discriminate against anyone on the grounds, amongst other things, of sexual orientation. While further Section 3.1 of the South African Schools Act of 1996 make a primary and a lower secondary school compulsory for all children between the ages of 7 to 15 years until the completion of grade 9, whichever occur first. It obliges every parent to ensure that every learner for whom or she is responsible to attend school every day during compulsory phases. The policy on learner attendance of the school to monitor daily attendance of learners and take supportive action where they are unlawfully absent. Now, the question that we need to ask ourselves is, in the light of today's discussion, whether there is adherence to the policy on attendance of learners, and whether there is that monitoring that takes place at the school level and why learners are absent, and whether the Department of Basic Education does address some of the issues that are faced by learners, in particular learners from the LGBTIQ sector. Further, the South African Schools Act of 1996, Section 5.5, provides that the admission policy of the public school is determined by the governing body of such school. Subject to applicable provincial law, a public school must admit learners and serve their educational requirements without unfairly discriminating in any way. The emphasis again there is that the public schools must admit learners without unfairly discriminated in any way. But what we have observed as a province of the Eastern Cape, as we have previous financial year, are also not constitutionally correct because they may infringe on the rights of the LGBTIQ learners. Now, the challenges with the guidelines for school uniform, as highlighted by Equal Education Law Center, are they are oppressive and stifling uniform policies, which leave little or no room for non-biological gender expression. Discrimination in the school against learners who are perceived to be lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, or intersex, or gender diverse severely impact on the ability of such learners to enjoy the right to education. The lack of training of educators on LGBTIQ and gender identity rights, gender neutral bathrooms, and allowing transgender and gender diverse learners to use bathroom associated with the gender they identified with.
Mr. Mrebu, I think we lost you there for one moment. If you can just backtrack maybe for 1 second. Thank you.
And the challenges with the guidelines for school uniform are as highlighted.
Mr. Mrebu, I think your...
Discrimination is...
Hi, can you hear me? I think we lost you there for 1 second again. Please continue though. We've got you.
Okay. In terms of the challenges with the guidelines for school uniform, as highlighted by Equal Education Law Center, they are oppressive and stifling uniform.
Mr. Mrebu, are you still there? I think we've lost you for 1 moment.
Caters on LGBTIQ and gender identity rights, gender neutral bathrooms, and allowing transgender and gender diverse learners to use the bathroom associated with the gender they identified with. Now, in terms of the best practice, in terms of the best practice, colleagues, can you go back to the next slide, which is slide number 10? The special rapporteur, the former UN special rapporteur, developed what we called a A-form framework, which stipulates that there must be a need to meet a prescribed legal standard, and state action must ensure education. First, state is required to provide a government-funded education system, an adequate infrastructure, and the training of teachers to provide education. In terms of accessibility, the special rapporteur cites this requires the state to ensure education is not discriminatory and B, noting the LGBTIQ. So education should not be discriminatory. Now, in terms of the guidelines that we have, the school uniform is defined in terms of boys and girls. It does not cater for the LGBTIQ community in terms of the guidelines. So therefore, I would say, in my view, they do not meet this particular requirement that the special rapporteur or the framework A4 that is being put forward to us to follow. Education is accessible to all, addressing economic and social barriers. And positive steps are taken to include the marginalized community and children. Now, in terms of school uniform, if we say positive steps are taken to include the most marginalized communities and children. Now, we all know that in terms of school uniform, this is too expensive to parents. in terms of the school uniform, purchase a school uniform every year out and every year in, you have to purchase a school uniform. Then hence the Competition Commission made a ruling in terms of the school uniform and proposed that the school uniform pricing should be regulated in terms of the so that there is no too much burden on the parents. I think that it's also looking at the economic factors that are affecting the parents in terms of the school uniform. However, the special rapporteur also cites that acceptable that the state and the content of education should be non-discriminatory. The content is culturally appropriate. The education is sufficiently high quality and the school environment is safe. Again, another measurement, there is an issue around the school measurement that the school environment should be safe. Now, the question is the school environment safe for the LGBTIQ learners? If in the case of the Eastern Cape province, we have educators that themselves are on the other side of the fence when it comes to the LGBTIQ learners. But also we are aware of the fact of the bullying that is taking place in school against the LGBTIQ learners. Again, one of the requirements in terms of the special rapporteur is that adaptability. This requires that the education is flexible and able to respond to the different needs of children and able to respond to the challenging needs of society. So our education should be adaptable. It should not be in a way that we're living in a former. We should take into consideration that we're in a constitutional democracy where rights of everybody that are enshrined in our constitution in terms of Section 9 should be treated equally. And also, it should also be taking into consideration the needs of society. But my view is that the needs of society versus the needs of, should cater the needs of everybody in the society. There should be no right that infringe on the rights of other individuals in terms of access to education. So even if we are saying it should be culturally acceptable, the content of therefore is whether are we not going to use, let's say there are those who are culturalists, for an example, who do not form or define themselves in a manner that respects the rights of other individuals. So the emphasis should be again be on the equal treatment of everybody within the education sector without having imposed your cultural perspective or cultural view. But the content should be in a way that respect those individual rights. The A4 framework recognizes the multiple dimension of the right to education. It recognizes the interconnectedness of the right to education and other rights, and that it recognizes the multiple organs of state are responsible for realization of the right to education. In addition, the state has an obligation in terms of Article 13.2 of the International Covenant on the Economic and Social and Cultural Rights to make education available, accessible, acceptable, and adaptable. The Convention on the Rights of the Children, Article 8, provides that the state parties undertake to respect the right of the child to preserve his or her identity without unlawfully interference. And again, the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, Article 21.1, state that the state parties to the present charter should take all appropriate measures to eliminate harmful socially and cultural practices affecting the welfare, dignity, normal growth, and the development of the child. And further, Article 11, sorry for this. Can we just hold on? I've just, where are my slides now? Are we still there? And further, Article 11 cites that every child shall have the right to education. Can we move over to the next slide? Now, the CGE proposed position on school uniform guidelines and the right to education. The concern is that the school uniform guidelines are still a draft and leave much to be desired, and do not embrace a human rights approach or do little to address homophobic attacks in South African schools. That's a concern that we have as a commission. The draft guidelines continue to reinforce sexist, discriminatory separation of girls and boys, and leaving little room for LGBTI students being able to wear uniform that fits with their gender expression. The CG is therefore calling upon the Department of Education to redraft the existing guidelines to accord the rights to human dignity and the right to education and freedom of expression. Can we move to the next slide? The guidelines do also contend that the refusal to wear a school uniform by student be treated as a disciplinary matter in terms of the school code of conduct. Now, again, if the guidelines have this, that those who refuse to wear school uniform should be subjected to disciplinary measures. So the guidelines, again, are acting in contrary to the rights that are enshrined in the Constitution as well in the Pepuda in terms of sexual orientation. This opens up the possibility of the LGBTI children to be subjected to disciplinary action where they refuse to wear a gender-appropriate uniform. The guideline must include a general non-discriminatory clause which specifically mentions the right of transgender, intersex children, and in particular, are not to be deprived of the right to basic education based on their gender expression and gender identity. That picture there, we seem to say we need to put ourselves in their shoes. If we were in their shoes, what would we have done? That's a question that the Department of Education should address. We need to put ourselves in the shoes of the LGBTIQ learners. Can we move to the next slide? The refusal by transgender and intersex child to wear a uniform that does not conform to their gender expression, they must be provided with an alternative to affirm their rights to expressing their gender identity, to express their gender identity. No child must be refused at admission or school access or access to school because of their gender identity or an expression. That transgender and intersex children have the right to human dignity and privacy, and the uniform rules must affirm these rights. The range of school uniform provided is not entirely representative. As we said, and the professor said before, the school uniform is defined in terms of boys and girls, does not take into consideration other community members of the society. The uniform choices provided generally conform with the established gender coding norms and provide little room for gender diverse expression. Can we move to the next slide? In terms of this is just a quote that we took in one of the submissions that were made by the University of KZN professor, where when he said, I open quote, create an education environment that does not discriminate directly or indirectly against anyone on the grounds including gender, sex, and sexual orientation, end quote. Now, the Constitution states that everyone has the right to express themselves. However, the draft guidelines are discriminatory by excluding those who in society are deemed as not appropriate. Can we move? I think that came to the end of our presentation as a CGE. But as I said, Program Director, the Commission has a draft school uniform position paper. But that draft school uniform position paper is still have to be adopted by the committee or by the commission of by the plenary, and then it will then be made public. That's a disclaimer that I wanted to put forward. But in terms of our interventions as an office, we have made some interventions in terms where learners from the LGBTIQ sector are being discriminated in the schools, but also young children in the province of the Eastern Cape. If they found themselves to be discriminated on the basis of their gender, we act without fear nor favor, as our act mandate us to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for that very clear presentation. There we go. Thank you very much, sir, for that very clear presentation, Mr. Mrebo. I think it's very valuable from the outset for us to understand the position of the Commission as well. I'm going to hand over to Commissioner. If there's any questions from your side, Commissioner. Mr. Mrebo, you're going to then be answering the questions from Commissioner, whereas after that, each panel member will pose questions or comments towards you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mrebo, and thank you for participating. I agree that your presentation was quite clear, and thank you for setting out the legal framework, also international terms, referring to the 4As, which is also the point of departure for the Commission when it comes to the right to a basic education, which is obviously immediately realizable, seen together with the important principle which applies here very specifically as well, and that is that in terms of our constitution, the rights of the child or the best interest of the child is paramount. I don't really have very specific questions. I think you've been quite clear, but I just wanted to point out that maybe we should see how we can work together and maybe get sight at some point of your draft school uniform policy that hasn't been approved yet. Because, as you might know, the Commission these days do not only issue recommendations, but indeed directives where appropriate. And it would indeed be important for this inquiry to have something to say, very specifically maybe in terms of directives pertaining to the draft national guidelines for school uniform. And this draft, could also be of assistance in that regard. So maybe we should work out some other way in which we can have sight of that, and also work some of the issues mentioned there, with recognition, of course, to the CGE, but into our recommendations and directives. That's the only point I wanted to make. Thank you so much.
Mr. Murphy, would you like to respond to that, or would you like us to move to the next question or comment? Do we still have Mr. Murebo? Is he off? Okay. Mr. Murebo, are you back with us? Mr. Murebo, sorry, can you hear me?
I can hear you. You can't hear me on the other side. I'm not sure what's going on.
Okay, we've got you now. Did you hear the questions posed by Commissioner Gam?
I was cut off when the commissioner was making his comments and questions. I could only hear the latter part where he said maybe they should take some of the recommendation into what you are going to submit as a Human Rights Commission. But generally, what the commissioner said first, I could not hear him. I was cut off.
Commissioner, would you like to say?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Provincial. The first part of what I said was basically just thanking you for your clear outlining of the legal position also internationally. And then I said that, maybe we should find a way of, in terms of your draft school uniform policy, even if it's not finalized yet, but with the necessary recognition to the CGE, to include some of those issues also in our recommendations and directives, because we don't only issue recommendations these days, but also directives. And given your very important comments pertaining to the draft national guidelines for school uniform, we might very well, following from this inquiry, want to issue pertinent directives, especially as far as the discriminatory nature thereof is concerned, firstly, but also, the lack of specific and pertinent protection for the LGBTI plus community. So those were my comments, but maybe the question then as to what extent, you would be able to share at some point your draft school uniform policy or position paper. Thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner, for the comment. In terms of the draft position paper by the CGE, I'm hoping by the end of this week, because the legal committee will be sitting on Thursday. So I'm hoping by the end of this week, the draft position paper will have been adopted by the legal committee that is led by commissioners. I will then share with our colleagues from the province, which then they could share with the participants the position paper of the Commission for Gender Equality. I will also communicate with the Office of the Chairperson in terms of the request to have the position paper be adopted by plenary after they have applied their mind, so that it is shared largely with all the participants that are here today. Thank you for those comments, Commissioner.
Thank you very much, Mr. Webb.
Thank you, Mr. Murebo. From my side, maybe just one comment and then another angle in respect of this discussion, and I'd like to hear your views on this. So, number one, you've touched on the guidelines very specifically. and that you are correct. My understanding is that these are still draft guidelines by the department. But it's dated 2005, my understanding. So it's interesting to see that we haven't moved very much in respect of being drafts, and also the language in respect of this guideline is not prescriptive. It recommends to schools, and certain elements are encouraged or discouraged. So there's almost not much of a stand taken when it comes to these binary recommendations, it would seem, from when we look at the guidelines. So just in respect of one of these areas, I'd like to hear you comment also on this, maybe just anecdotally. But from the guidelines, it says, for instance, girls are not allowed to wear short trousers, which I thought is very interesting. So they're allowed to wear short skirts, but not short trousers. I wonder what the causa behind that would have been, but it's there clearly in the gazetted guideline. And then that's more of a comment, but I'd like to hear your views when we do still differentiate in respect of the binary approach between girls and boys. Do you think it discriminatory where we allow girls to have long hair, whereas we ask from boys to cut their hair, and that their hair is not allowed to touch their ears or their collar? So you've had a full presentation. Thank you so much about the LGBTIQ plus community. We've taken that on board, and it's very, very clear. I'd just like to hear your comment on this specific topic where we determine that boys are not allowed to have long hair. What would be your view on that? Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dr. Carter. My view is simple. Is that what applies to the left hand side must also be applied to the right hand side. But my view is there should be no discrimination based on the expression by either learners, either be boys or be girls. I don't see an issue with learners having whether short hair or long hair, because that does not interfere with their education. As long as it's not interfering with the education, I don't see it why should be a prescribed in terms of the guidelines that they should be long or short hair. So it will be sort of infringing on the rights of those individuals who want maybe to have long hairs, or some who wants to have short hairs. But as long as those rights that are enshrined in our constitution in terms of freedom of association, freedom of expression are not infringed. So if the guidelines interfere with the freedom of expression, if girls have long hairs, it's their choice to have those. It should not be a matter of them being discriminated. So that is my view, Doc. I don't think it's right to discriminate based on your expression or based on your sexual identity.
May I quickly come in there? And would you agree that that would apply to private schools and public schools, so that the the relevant rights will indeed apply horizontally as well as concerning private schools?
We should use the constitution as a barometer, because our constitution applies to all of us, whether we're in a public space or in a private space. So again, the guidelines there, when they put emphasis on public schools, they make as if private schools could do things willy-nilly without having observed the laws of the country. So my view is it should also apply to all schools in the Republic of South Africa in observance of the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa or any other legislation. It should not be only be applied to public schools only.
Um, and further on that point, what is the basis you think that schools use to actually have these different rules pertaining to hair in relation to boys and girls? Is there some religious argument for that, or is it just simply a militaristic kind of approach coming from the past, or what on earth is this? Is it something that has remained from so-called Christian national education, or why do schools have this position?
I'm not sure why the schools have this perception, but the guidelines, as I said, they 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 have loopholes. The guidelines have loopholes in a way that schools are able to do things that are not in line with the, let's say, with the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa. And the fact that we still have guidelines which are still in draft forms also allows, and also the schemes of the Schools Act, the powers are also given much to the school governing bodies without having tell them that this is the means of measurements. This is a constitution that will be guiding us in terms of developing whatever policies that they want to develop, as long as those policies are not in contrary with what is espoused in terms of our constitutions and the values that are enshrined in our constitution. So the state in this instance, I would say, it gives more powers to the school governing body and to the schools themselves. But again, ultimately, the state is a securer of these rights, and it should come to the party when schools are acting contrary to the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Mrebo. The last set of questions will come from my colleague. Just maybe that's just mutual. And then we will take it from there.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mkwebo, for your presentation. I don't have any questions from my side.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Mrebo, it looks like we have come to the end of the questions and answers session with yourself. I think if we can maybe just engage going forward in respect of your draft position on the school uniforms, that would be very valuable. And also we have a copy then of your presentation, which is also going to assist us in going forward. So thank you so much. It was really interesting and informing having this discussion with you, and we look forward to working with you in the province as well.
Thank you. Also,
thank you, sir. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Mr. Mkwebo.
All right. Just once. Okay. Is Forte ready? Okay. Should we maybe take a 5-minute? And then I just want to run to the bathroom quick. Just check. Good morning again, everyone in attendance. I think we're going to reconvene. We do apologize for the extended body breaks. It is a question of making sure the technology is still with us. So thank you for bearing with us. And Zuki is available on WhatsApp and on email if there's any arrangement that needs to be made in respect of the presentations. So next up, we have the University of Fort Hare, Advocate Seti and Dr. Ndlovu. Can I just get an indication whether we are joined by these two individuals? You're welcome to switch on your cameras and your microphones and to join us. Advocate Seti, I think you are muted. I can see. Oh, Advocate Seti, just one moment. I can't hear you yet. Let me just. All right. Advocate Seti, Dr. Ndlovu, can you hear us? All right. No, I think we will be able to hear you. And I think if I can then give over to whomever, is it you, who's going to be the first speaker between the two of you? All right, Dr. Ndlovu, thank you so much. So over to you. After your presentation, it is my advice that you will then be followed up by Advocate Seti, who will also be contributing. And then we will be posing questions and comments to both of you after your presentation. So thank you so much for joining us today. The floor is yours. Not yet. There we go. Thank you, please. Thank you.
I think that there's been a lot of dragging, and I think Dr. Carter and Prof in the morning did maybe raise that. To say, why do we still have guidelines, 10, 20 years later or so? So the context in which I'm going to present this presentation perhaps is to try and look at discrimination towards learners who practice their religious and cultural beliefs or practices by wearing or maybe learners who identify as gender non-conforming who wish to wear uniforms that represent how they feel, how they identify. And I've already seen some of the noises that are being made by the Commission for Gender, and I'm glad it's happening. Now, as an introduction, maybe let me say that rules and laws are not static. And I think it is important that in establishing relationships such as those in schools, there's constant need, to ensure that certain rules are questioned, certain rules certain laws, guidelines, and regulations are sort of contextualized and brought in line with the Constitution, especially in our context. And this will take me maybe to what we all know about, the mantra or the principle of transformative constitutionalism, that there are certain other ills that still exist in this particular context in schools. Section 7 of the Constitution, is of great reference, and I'll talk about it shortly. Now, maybe before I even move, I want to say that even at highest level of human rights protection, at the UN level, they still sort of take into account one of the places where gender discrimination, social discrimination is taking place, and a lot of exclusion is in the education sector and in schools. So it is very important that we've got conversations such as this. So what's the legal framework then in relation to the current context? So very briefly is the Constitution, and I think the other colleagues have spoken about it. I'll just touch on a few sections, and the other section, my colleague will talk about it in much broader sense. Of course, the Schools Act, the Children's Act, the Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act, and of course, we have to look at as to what is expected of us in terms of international legal obligations. And I think very important, this inquiry will look as to what other jurisdictions are doing in relation to similar perhaps practices or challenges rather, and of course the jurisprudence from our courts, which our advocates Seti will talk about. Now, if you go to the Constitution, colleagues, you will then see that the very founding values, which are found in sections, I think 1, 7, 36, and 39, by now it is acceptable that our society should be one of equality, respect to human dignity, and of course freedom. Of course, within the parameters of section 36, that then give us as to under what circumstances can we limit a right, for instance. I will talk about this because the whole inquiry, at least from a legal perspective, involves balance in competing interests. On one hand, to keep schools safe, and also ensure that schools are places where children actually freely express themselves to develop to be responsible citizens. I'm not going to talk about section 2. I think it is almost obvious to all of us, the supremacy clause, and therefore, as what our colleagues spoke about earlier, should be the yardstick through which we measure the regulations, the guidelines, and of course the code of different schools as to the fact that does it meet that standard? If it doesn't, what can be changed or what can be done? Section 7 is the obligation clause as to what is expected. Schools, especially public schools, I will extend to private schools, and I will take into account the question that Commissioner Gama asked our colleague earlier, But I'll say that Section 7, read together with Section 8, does allow application of the Bill of Rights to extend even to private education institutions, of course, because of the, they are rendering a public service and government function, and therefore there's need for that coverage by the Constitution. And of course, the right to equality, which must be enjoyed by everyone, including learners who are non-gender conforming, and learners of different races, learners of different ethnic groups, etc. Section 10, the right to human dignity. I still don't know what human dignity means, but at least in this particular context, I would say that a humane way of treating someone, taking into account their human worth. And of course, very important, what I'm going to talk about as well is freedom of expression in section 16, because it goes beyond just speech. As you will see that even the draft guidelines, do refer to the freedom of expression principle and its importance, especially in the realization of any person's rights. And of course, section 15, read together with section 30 and 31 on religious and cultural practices. So all these are afforded to everyone. They are enjoyed by everyone, and they must be enjoyed by everyone, including learners in schools. Of course, the section 28 that our colleague spoke about. Section 29, my colleague will talk about. And maybe lastly, I'll then look at section 36. This is infused in the discussion, colleagues. So now if you go to the legislative framework, and I think the main act in this particular context is the Schools Act. And in its preamble does, the evil past or the lacunas within our legal system, and sort of tells us as to the way or the route we should take, in drafting policies, in regulating schools, etc. And I highlighted certain things from the preamble of this particular act, and to me, it sounds as though the purpose of, or what must drive the Department of Basic Education should be what is found in this preamble. And it says, whereas the achievement of democracy in South Africa is consigned to history, the past systems of education, which was based on racial inequality and segregation, and whereas this country requires a new national system for schools, which redress past injustices in educational provision, provide an education of progressively high quality for all learners, and in so doing lay a strong foundation for the development of all our people's talents and capabilities, advance democratic transformation of society, again, the issue of transformative constitutionalism, combat racism and sexism and all other forms of unfair discrimination and intolerance, contribute to the eradication of poverty, etc. But what I want to focus on is what is highlighted there, that it acknowledges the diverse society we find ourselves in, but at the same time, want us at least to forge a society wherein there is tolerance. Everyone is allowed to freely express themselves within the dictates, of course, of the Constitution and the law as it will. Now, and to me, that should be the guiding factor to to the Department of Basic Education colleagues who at least draft even broader guidelines and of course provincial guidelines, coming all the way down to schools. And now, also the Schools Act is important because it gives certain autonomy to school governing bodies to regulate schools, which is fine because they understand the context, they understand what may be the needs in a particular space. Now, why am I bringing this into account? Of course, the other section that dealing with discrimination, I think our colleagues have already touched on those, so I'm not going to refer to them. I'm bringing this into the fore because it is important in this context to emphasize that all the approach taken by the Department of Basic Education should promote a culture of reconciliation. This is right from their website. Teaching, learning, and mutual respect, and the establishment of a culture of tolerance and peace in all schools. In other words, any code of conduct in a school, whether it is regulating uniforms, whether it is about behavior, whether it's about sports or anything, should at all times be in line with what is provided for in the preamble of the Act. Now, I laughed in the morning when Prof was presenting because I found some very interesting, perhaps reasons as to why do we even need uniforms anyway, Though of course we know that to some extent, schools are allowed, this autonomy to make school uniforms. So they are saying mostly it is acceptable use of school uniforms to ensure discipline, positive discipline, identification, and to ensure there's equality and same treatment among learners, both from needy backgrounds and those from well-off backgrounds. When I was doing research, there was one case from the US, where they said that the imposition of mandatory school uniforms brought about, positive change, this academic performance and so forth. But I'm trying to find the link between these two to say how does the school uniform or how one appears, sort of contribute to academic performance. Maybe there's a colleague I think from the program who's going to talk about the psychological effects and so maybe they may help us in that regard. But from a legal background, I still don't see the nexus between those. So now if you go to the draft guidelines, which I've got a problem about because as long as 2005, 2006, thereabout, and what I realized also is that there are two different drafts. One doesn't have other things, and the other one that I saw, is other things. But let's bring our attention to what is said here. It says the adoption of the school uniform could promote school safety, improve discipline, and enhance the learning environment. The potential benefits of school uniforms include decreasing violence and theft, which I think Prof in the morning spoke about, but also I've got my own reservations about this, helping prevent gang members from wearing gang colors and in senior school, perhaps, instilling discipline in pupils, helping parents and pupils resist peer pressure, helping pupils concentrate on their work, I don't know how, helping school officials recognize intruders who come to school, perhaps that is a valid one, Now, again, from the draft guidelines, what we see, and I've got a problem with this because we're still talking about draft guidelines. Number one, they are problematic on their own in terms of substance, but we should be talking about finalized, guidelines that are, though they are not binding, of course, but at least they are giving guidance to educators, schools, etc. Now, they expressly provide that the purpose of these guidelines is to ensure the practices related to school uniform do not impede access to education. And I think one colleague did mention this earlier. And do not infringe on any constitutional right of any person, whether on the grounds of gender, sex, cultural beliefs or religious beliefs. Though, again, I will emphasize that these are not absolute. Now, be sensitive to them when designing a new school uniform. And of course, they should show sensitivity, to age, gender, and of course, I think I should add sexual orientation. But I saw this from the guidelines, on religious and cultural diversity. And guideline 29 provides as follows: that a school uniform policy or dress code should consider religious and cultural diversity within the community served by the school, and they should take into account religious and cultural diversity within the community served by the school, and measures should be included to accommodate learners whose religious beliefs and cultural practices are compromised by a uniform requirement. If wearing a particular attire such as yarmulkes and headscarves is part of the religious practice of the learners or an obligation, schools should not, in terms of the Constitution, prohibit the wearing of such items. Now, I think this brings the discussion closer to home, because I think case law from the courts is what advocate will talk about. They have sort of gave us guidance. So is it that schools are ignorant, or they still, I'm not so sure whether they are not aware of some of the judgments that are out there, because we should by least have guidance from the jurisprudence of our courts. And it goes on to say male learners specifically are requested to keep, requesting to keep a beard as part of a religious practice may be required by the school to produce a letter from their religious teacher or organization substantiating the validity of their request. I have a problem with this, especially taking into account what the Constitutional Court, perhaps has said. But anyway, it's some commitment at least to allow, inclusivity. Now, I'll jump that slide for the purpose of time. Now, the inference drawn is that the guideline, at least on paper, appear to be alive to the rise to culture and religion of learners. Though, of course, I'm well aware of the tempo that is within those drafts, that it only refers to boys and girls and does not refer to children or learners that are gender non-conforming. For the purpose of time, so I jumped that part. So what remains a challenge, however, may be the implementation of this particular guideline once it is enforced. And this is because of the competing interest of, between the schools and learners. Now, what perhaps maybe should be a recommendation here as I take the discussion through is that there need to be wider discussions, especially on the issue of gender conforming learners, because I think the issue of cultural and religious beliefs must be beyond us now. It must be settled in our law that there should be reasonable accommodation in terms of that. But maybe perhaps there may be still challenges in terms of the non-conforming gender learners, as it were, because they then get excluded. Now, from social media, you then see that there are learners whose accessories, cultural and religious accessories, have been either cut off by teachers or they've been banned or whatever the case may be. And sometimes learners who come from the initiation schools are not allowed to put on part of their uniform, especially the hat, because it has got a serious significance in terms of culture, so there have been challenges here and there, and we are well aware about this. But what we see is we must get solace from the guidelines for the consideration of governing bodies in adopting a code of conduct for learners. It's a 1998 guideline, and it has got some very, important, I think, considerations for this particular inquiry. Guideline 4.4 on the Code of Conduct guidelines says all learners have a right to freely express themselves. This is in principle an acceptable approach as it advances the society that is envisaged by the Constitution. But very importantly, it provides as follows, and I quote: freedom of expression is more than just freedom of speech. The freedom of expression includes the right to seek, to hear, to read, and to wear. Freedom of expression is extended to forms of outward expression as seen in the clothing selection and hairstyles. However, learners' rights to enjoy freedom of expression are not absolute. Vulgar words, insubordination, and insults are not protected speech or expression. So there is no mention there of hairstyles and so forth. So the only exceptions that are put there are those. When the expression leads to a material and substantial disruption in school operations, activities, or rights of other learners, this can be limited as being unacceptable. And I do agree, because then, of course, it will meet the threshold made by Section 36. But also very important, guideline 4.3 states that every learner has that implies mutual respect, including respect for another's convictions and cultural traditions. And every learner also has the right to privacy, which includes the right not to have his or her property searched. I think I wanted to bring the very first part of that guideline. So these guidelines are on how schools should draft their code of conduct, including a code of conduct on uniforms. Hence, I'm bringing it to the fore because it is in line with the Schools Act. Now, the only permissible limitation, at least in terms of the law, I think should be the one that must meet the standards set forth by Section 36. And some of the examples that I'm seeing from other jurisdictions is wherein maybe a certain clothing, promotes violence, vulgar, disturb the school management activities, pose danger to other learners, teachers, and admin staff as it were. Now, the question that then, that maybe I should leave with all of us is how do dreadlocks and Afro hairstyles disrupt school operations? How should children with dreadlocks in school and Afro or natural hair be accommodated, especially in instances where such practices are in line with their identity, or who they are, or their cultural and those religious convictions? At the same time, we should ask the question on behalf of children who are gender non-conforming. This is a reality. They are our children. We find ourselves, in this space. Now, what I'm seeing is that the law does put in place at least, the parameters under which to accommodate these learners, all of them. But the challenge perhaps may be the implementation or the ignorance and the conservative nature of some of the schools and caregivers, parents, etc. Now, hence the need for reasonable accommodation and tolerance. So an inference drawn from the above regulation, colleagues, is that there's need to create an environment that provides for reasonable accommodation and tolerance where learners can freely express themselves. This is especially important because of the conflicting interests. So any school governing body, if they're drafting their codes, they need to apply their man completely and take into cognizance what the law says. Because they've already said this, that the Constitution does not tolerate diversity as a necessary evil, but affirms it as an instrument and treasures of our, primary treasures of our nation. And again, in the principles as the president of the Law Society of the Cape of Good Hope clearly stated that the test for tolerance in society comes not in accepting what is familiar and easily accommodated, but in giving reasonable to what is unusual, bizarre, or even threatening, as it were. Now, I think I'm going to leave it at this case now. We're going to share the concept note. We're actually in the process of drafting it. These are just slides, so that at least maybe they can add to your inquiry. But I want to end with the Christian education case, because in that case, the court was very adamant and at pains to explain that sometimes it may be necessary to take positive measures and even incur extra hardship by schools, to ensure that every child is allowed to access school without discrimination of any kind whatsoever. I will share the rest of other principles later so that I can give over to my colleague. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Over to you, Advocate.
I need to stop sharing. I think, yeah.
I'm trying to share my slides, and hopefully I will succeed in doing so. Am I right when I'm thinking that it's reflecting on your side?
It's almost reflecting. I think we're seeing your desktop view now. I think once you double click on your presentation, we'll be with you.
Okay.
You can just open the slides to share.
Yes.
Usually it's easier if you open the test conditions from the open screen.
Sharing the screen. Can you guys see the slides?
Not yet the slides, but we can see you're attempting to open it.
Okay, no problem. I'll stop sharing then.
So that this is
Yes, yes. This is one. This is it. All right, should be fine now.
All right.
Thank you so much. We can see
Thank you
it.
so much. I'm sure it's reflecting now. Okay. I'm just picking up on what Dr. Ndlovu has said in setting out the legal framework. But I'll be, without rehashing what he said, try to highlight some of the few points building on what he has already touched on. Okay, so starting from the purpose of the presentation, which is the right to basic education. If you look into it, as a matter of fact, I know we'll all agree that there is no detailed definition of what this right it's all about. In particular, there is no scope and content of the right. And the reason why I'm highlighting that is because when if you're going to look into whether there has been infringement of the right or not, it's important for you to understand what are the boundaries of the right concerned. However, something that is very helpful is the fact that at least there are key features of the right that we seem to be a common cause facts. One of which is that the right is basic education is unqualified and immediately realizable. In other words, it's unlike other socioeconomic rights. And secondly, the issue of quality, it's very important. And number three is that the right to education must be understood in light of its main aim, which is the full development of the human personality and to the strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. It's a very important point, but most of them, I'll come back to them later on. The right to basic education is key to the enjoyment and exercise of other rights. And the last feature that I want to highlight is the fact that the right to basic education provided by school must be available, accessible, adaptable, and acceptable. When it comes to the last point, without belaboring that issue, it's important to understand that for the purposes of the right to basic education, when we talk about availability or accessibility or acceptability, those or adaptability, those concepts are defined in bit of different terms to what we would consider in the ordinary meaning of those words. And the definition, you find it in the general comment number 13 published by the Committee on Social, Economic and Cultural Rights. Let me just highlight that point and proceed to look into one of the issues that is the subject matter of this inquiry, which is school uniform. It appears that the general acceptable use of school uniform, it's something that Dr. Ndlovu mentioned earlier on, is to ensure discipline, identification, and to ensure there's equality and same treatment among learners, both from different backgrounds, regardless. And if you look into the guidelines, again, they also make mention of the purpose of school uniforms, which is that the adoption of a school uniform could promote school safety, improve discipline, and enhance the learning environment. Again, if you look into Section 8 of the Act, it says, is the one that says, that speaks about the code of conduct, and it says any code must be aimed at establishing discipline and purposeful school environment dedicated to the improvement and maintenance of the quality of the learning process. I'm just highlighting those points to set out the background for what I intend to cover later on. If you look into what I've already said about the purpose of school, that there is no doubt that the idea of school uniform, it's education or the goal of education, which is the full development of the human personality and to the strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. In other words, you can align the purpose of school uniform as well as the aim of education, hand in hand. But now the problem with school uniform or any other form of with that challenge, what it means is that the issue of school uniform, good as it is, but something that needs to be monitored so that in its at least it must also make sure, or the responsible authorities should make sure that it doesn't get to a level where on the rights of the learners. And very importantly, what we need to keep in mind when dealing with the issue of school uniform, as well as other rights that are entrenched in the Constitution, is the question of whether is it what is prohibited or learners are prohibited from doing. Is it material and substantial disruptive in the of the school operations, activities, or the rights of the others? So if we do that, at least we can be able to say if it's not, then we need to limit the right of learners not to be we need to limit the rights of learners in line with the provisions of Section 36 of the Constitution. Now, the danger with again with the school uniform, of course, that emanates from our historical background, is the fact that it's got a tendency of infringing or discriminating, and not only discriminating but also infringing on the constitutional right of the said learners, including the very right to basic education, which is the subject matter of this inquiry. Sorry. Now, with that background, let me look into the legal position in line with these three scenarios. One,